Very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We do have a packed agenda today and excited to get going. We'll just wait for maybe one more minute for people joining in to get settled, and then we'll just begin right away. All right. So, in the interest of everyone's time, why don't we begin? And we will leave a few minutes at the end for question and answers too. So today's discussion is all about architecting on the landing zone. And on the next slide, I will give an introduction of the presenters for today's webinar. I'll also speak a couple of minutes about the company. And after that, we will get right into the meat of today's discussion, which is around what are some of the best practices in designing and architecting a landing zone in your cloud adoption and migration journey. We will also take one of our recent success stories, our use case, and talk about our approach and some of the findings from there. We also hope to cover a couple of questions during our Q&A. So we just hope it's exciting and meaningful for everyone today. So let's dive right in. So a quick introduction. My name is Amit Gandhi, and I'm the co-founder and CTO for Parkar Digital. And I also have with me today Jigar Shah, who leads our cloud practice and is one of the chief architects for Parkar Digital. A quick recap of this webinar series and the previous webinar that we conducted about a month ago on the best practices around discovery or assessment. We also had a short demo on one of the tools, one of the accelerators that we have been using to automate and to make this entire journey more meaningful and insightful. We have received a lot of positive feedback on that, and we hope to continue the momentum with providing a lot of real world insights based upon our experience and what we are seeing by helping various customers in their journey. The next two parts after today's webinar will also be scheduled very soon. So do look out for those. And we will also incorporate a couple of other tool walkthroughs and demos to help automate this journey and mitigate any unforeseen risks. A very quick intro about Parkar Digital. We are now into our 8th year of service, working with more than 80 enterprise clients across 10 time zones. We have almost 300 plus cloud educated engineers with various specializations, and many of them are certified to work on multiple clouds. Some of the strategic partnerships that we have made along the way include all the leading cloud providers in AWS, Azure, GCP, as well as others on the application or tooling side in Red Hat or Science Logic or Tidal, for example. Almost all of the engineering that we do is centered around the cloud, right from doing assessments with the migration strategy to the cloud to actually implementing application modernization and innovation while following the best practices around compliance and security. Most of our recent engagements have been with healthcare, retail, and high tech, but we are actually domain agnostic, having a lot of experience with almost any other vertical. Now let's get right into the landing zone, which is the topic for today's discussion. So every organization migrating to or implementing on the cloud has different needs and priorities, which means there is no one size fits all template for best practices. However, a well designed and well executed landing zone is the next best thing, providing an organizational template for deploying workloads into the cloud. Simply put, a landing zone is comprised of building blocks that cover foundational elements of cloud deployments. These building blocks might include governance, data security, network design and logging, as well as multi-account architecture and identity access management. They are configured in line with the broader organizational strategy and industry regulations, enforcing best practices for any workload deployed on the cloud. Critical hygiene factors like security and compliance are baked in so that the development team, the engineering team can focus all of their time and energy on activities that actually deliver value. They can also be given greater autonomy to explore the full potential of the cloud when these foundations are in place. Meanwhile, the overall risk is reduced because landing zones provide guardrails to prevent the environment from becoming an unwieldy, invisible, and expensive entity that is difficult to control. Now that we have established the importance of landing zones, I will invite Jigar to go in depth about them and walk you through some of the important principles. Jigar?
Hey, thanks, Amit. So if we can switch to next slide, right? While we have set the context, it's kind of important for us to understand why do we need landing zone, right? And so it's very clear that we need landing zone for a cloud. But apart from that, when we are talking about cloud adoption, there are different expectations everybody has, right? I mean, you have the way I always say. The cloud adoption, you have different stakeholders starting from developer who are most keen on the journey because they have a lot at stake. You have business units and business entities who want to have a lot more agile, rapid pace growth happening. You have IT infrastructure or IT operations team, who's also a stakeholder when you talk about cloud adoption. And everybody has a different need, right? Your developer team's desire when we talk about cloud is that we want to build our applications in a much faster way. They want to move much faster into production. So the release timeline, what they are looking at, they want extremely fast-paced release management, right? So ideation to implementation time, they want to shorten it. And they say, okay, while we do this, help us stay secure. We are application developer. We don't want to focus on the security layer. Security should be built-in functionality of my cloud. I don't want to have a bolted on functionality of security, right? And the expectation from cloud environment at the same time is it should be secure and compliant all the time. It should provide me scalability. It should provide me resilient environment, irrespective of the workload I decide to move to a cloud or workload I decide to build within cloud directly, right? And while we do all this, you should retain adaptability and flexibility in the environment, which means I should have flexibility to migrate. I should have flexibility to change the workload as I need. And like if I need to modify certain things, I should have flexibility to do that as well. And this is why it's very important to have well-architected, very well-defined landing zone so that we are able to cater to most of the desire, most of the expectations. If you go to the next slide, we touch upon a little more in detail on what exactly is a landing zone, right? Now, when we talk about landing zone, I'm sure everybody is, or most of us are very familiar with the image on the right-hand side, right? Tenant group, network group, application, network resource group, and application resource group. I think that's the first architecture texture most of us designed when we initiated our journey or when we were actually dirtying our hands with the cloud, right? You spin up or you create the tenant in Azure or AWS or GCP, whatever cloud we're going to talk about. The naming convention varies, but the conceptualization remains the same. So you create a tenant, and within tenant, you first set up the network, and then you set up your application group, and then you start putting your the workloads within that, your compute, your storage, in network, you talk about your firewall, your load balancers, your VNets and routes and all of that. So that's how we typically created our first Azure workload or AWS workload. And that's how we started our journey. And from there, right, we kept on adding more and more feature, more and more complexity to the tenant what was created originally. And this is what I'm talking about when we started early adoption of cloud. Now, this makes it quite complex as we progress further. We would have started with a small dev workload, move it into the cloud, started our journey, and then suddenly you have next workload in queue. It's your SAP application, or you have your application team talking about creating or utilizing Azure, maybe AKS services, right? And moment we start adding more and more application workloads, more and more subscription, right? It adds to the complexity. And that's where the landing zone helps us, right? Your landing zone is basically, it's an output of a multi-subscription environment that accounts for scale, security management, governance, networking, identity. The primary focus, right, that is something called core group, right, which is your management. How do you manage entire Azure subscription? How are you going to manage all your environment, which is getting migrated to Azure, whether it's a small environment, large environment, enterprise-grade environment, hybrid environment. So how are you going to do the management of that? How are you going to secure your environment, right? When we talk about security, it's all about how we want to have role-based access, how are you going to secure your traffic, and then comes the governance part of it, right? Which is all about how are you going to apply policies to the cloud, which means, I mean, when workloads are getting created into Azure or workloads are getting migrated to Azure, certain policies which you decide as the organization policies are getting applied, right? Where you're restricting type of workload somebody can spin up into Azure, or a type of resource group they can create into Azure, or the kind of naming convention or the tags you want to apply by default for your billing purpose, and all of it can be governed through this, right? And the governance layer. And at the same time, you have other core functions, right? Which is your billing and Active Directory tenant, how you're going to have authentication and authorization, how are you going to leverage your Azure Active Directory, how are you going to do your billing? Your billing, will it be done based on business unit? Your billing, will it be done based on your application workloads? Are you going to do or govern your billing based on the regions? So there are multiple ways to do this, right? And it's important to define how we're going to do the billing. And hence, when you are doing landing zone creation, this becomes a crucial consideration for you. Same way, you have resource organization, right? What all the resource you are going to share. As simple as, I mean, I can have a DevOps as a part of subscription, and I have a GitHub repository there, a private GitHub repository, all my platform spin up scripts are deployed over there. Anybody who wants to deploy workload, they can access that GitHub repository centrally and perform all the provisioning activities. So that can be done, right? Second part is identity and access management. What principles we are going to follow for access management? What access, or I mean, how we're going to control which resource has access to which subscription, which resource has access to which network resource, system resource, so on and so forth, right? So the whole role-based access comes into the play over here. And then the network topology, how do I want to route traffic? Now, when we talk about the landing zone, it's very important to consider our network topology within the landing zone, which comes as a part of connectivity subscription. And the reason why it's important, because this is where you control your network traffic. If you don't control it, if you keep creating subscription and each subscription has its own network connectivity, then it's very difficult for the management group or the IT operations team to know what kind of traffic is flowing between subscriptions, right? It's equally difficult to control cost of your ingress and egress traffic. Hence, the connectivity topology and the connectivity subscription within the landing zone becomes very crucial, and that needs to be considered into your design principles when we talk about landing zone. But yeah, in a nutshell, right, when we talk about landing zone, it's predominantly multi-subscription environment in a hierarchical order, where you are kind of trying to control scale, you are trying to put control around security and governance, where you're trying to have well-defined networking components well-defined, where you have identity well-defined, where you have your billing taken care of, where you have your management of entire Azure is taken care of. If you go to the next slide, where we talk a little more about how does this whole landing zone works, right? So if you look at landing zone, they are predominantly of two type. Now, based on the technology you choose, based on the public cloud provider you choose, this terminology varies. And if we need to do session on landing zone across all, I think it would take a couple of days of workshop. But for simplification, we are using Azure as the point of today's discussion. And when we talk about Azure landing zone, predominantly they are divided in two parts: platform landing zones and the application landing zone. In AWS world, they call it control landing zone and application landing zone and user landing zone. There are different ways to define it. Now, when we talk about platform landing zone, it's basically your subscription which are associated with centralized services or your shared services, correct? Now, what are the example of shared services? Your identity is a shared services because you are going to use your identity across all application workloads, what you create. Your networking is your shared services because you're going to have network connectivity, your traffic flowing between one application to another application across all the application stack, whether it's SAP, whether it's AKS, whether it's Azure VMware services, whether it's platform as a service, directly provision into Azure, whatever it is. But your networking becomes part of shared services. Management, again, a very crucial component, but it's a shared services, right? It's a part of your platform zone, platform landing zone. Now, when we talk about management, it's all about how are you going to manage your logs? How are you going to do your log monitoring? How are you going to do your keyword? How are you going to do your monitoring of the services, right? Like monitoring of system resources, monitoring of your billing, monitoring of your cost overhead. So that management, again, it's a part of your centralized landing zone, part of your platform landing zone. Now, the reason we need to focus on the platform or the shared services part, right, is when we do this, we need to align it with the IT organization structure, what you have. Now, what kind of IT organization you have? Do you have IT organization which is verticalized based on the technology stack, or you have IT which is kind of a pod structure where you say, okay, every application has its own pod, which has development team, infra team, security team, put into one pod and managing end-to-end application workload, or your IT teams are based on your business units, right? So each business unit has its own IT team. So when you're creating a shared services, it's a kind of convergence, right? Where you need to try and create your landing zone, and accordingly you need to kind of make some changes within your IT team as well, because you're moving towards shared services architecture, you're moving towards management service being provided to all application workload, you're moving towards networking services being provided to all application workloads. Now, there are pitfalls. I mean, these are guidelines, obviously, you can change them, but there are pitfalls as well when you change them, right? Because if you have different team managing different networking, then you may have overlapping network services getting provisioned. You may have cost overrun, right? And hence we say, okay, when we are creating a landing zone at the planning stage, you need to create your application, or sorry, you need to create your landing zone with IT operations in mind, and define shared services very clearly at that stage. And then you create application landing zones, which are basically how are your application workloads defined? Are there applications which are centrally managed applications? You have applications which are based on the technology stack, which says, okay, fine, anybody who wants Kubernetes services-led applications, right? They fall under same bucket. So you can create a technology platform, you can create a AKS subscription, and everybody who wants AKS would consume services or provision resources within that subscription. If your applications are based on different workloads, right, like SAP workload, your HRMS workload, your systems of engagement workloads, and they can have multiple applications underneath, right? If you say my systems of engagement, starting from your website to your CRM to everything becomes part of your systems of engagement, and you can create a subscription which is for systems of engagement because they are external facing applications where users are going to access applications or sites from external world, and that workload can become one subscription and all such application become part of that subscription. So that's how we kind of try to group application landing zone into different format, right? Whether it's a centrally managed, technology driven, workload driven. And again, like I said, it's very crucial to plan this beforehand, because if this is not planned beforehand, right, you may land up in scenario where you need to start moving application or start migrating application between different subscriptions, correct? And hence we give a lot of emphasis on a planning stage when you are going to plan this landing zone, how you plan the landing zone, and then post that align it with your IT operations need, align it with your billing patterns, and then create a landing zone. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, now some of the design principles, right? And I'll touch very briefly on this because we covered most of the points in previous slide, but the important point here is your how you're going to create your subscription, right? Are you like create subscription based on unit of management, scale it based on the application migrations? We give example. You have, let's say, systems of engagement created within one subscription, which says, okay, name it whatever you like, right? But it's a systems of engagement subscription where all your typical policies and controls are common. And then you have application workloads underneath, which has application centric or application specific permissions given to them. Right? And when we give permissions, again, we need to be extremely careful because in Azure world, when we are giving application, it's not most restrictive permission which gets applied. It's actually a cumulative permission which gets applied, right? So let's say, for example, at subscription level, if I have given a read permission, and at the application level, sorry, at the subscription level, if I have given contributor permission, at the application level, if I give read permission, a user or a person will get cumulative permission, which means he will have read plus contributor permission to it. So hence, when we are talking about creating this work, creating this subscription within the landing zone, we need to look at identity and access management very carefully. The second point, policy driven, right? When we are talking about creating landing zones, we need to keep in mind that we should create landing zones and it should have policy driven governance. Now, there are two parts to it. We got Azure policy and we have Azure role-based access, and both are different. Correct. Your role-based access is basically who can provision workload, what kind of workload they can provision, what access they will have, contributor access, read-only access, so on and so forth. When we talk about policy, it's more from the governance standpoint, and it's very important to have Azure policies being utilized because you want to align your Azure policy with certain compliance standards you need to follow. We always say, okay, for a billing purpose, easiest thing to do is put a tag on a resource, right? And then consolidate the tags, and I know what is the billing for the specific tag. But let's be honest, right? We have seen so many deployments, we have seen so many examples or so many scenarios where right tags were not given. Correct, they were missed out during the implementation phase, or they were missed out while provisioning workload in hash rate situation. Azure policy would certainly help you with that, right? So if during provisioning stage, if somebody misses to apply a tag, with Azure policy, you can apply those tags automatically. You can also control kind of resource one can provision, correct? Now, you have created a subscription, which is which is for, let's say, chatbots, right? And a normal chatbot for interaction with end users, right? To just to take care of grievances. Now, you don't want somebody to provision N-type or NVIDIA high GPU virtual machine into that subscription. With Azure policy, you'll be able to control that. And hence we say when we are doing landing zone, in one of the design principles, we need to make sure that we have policy driven governance created and restrict all these areas, right? Single control management plane. It's again a very important element because, like I said, when we are talking about cloud adoption, landing zone journey, we might end up in a scenario where we need to tweak our IT operations a bit and move more towards the centralized management. And with Azure, or when we are creating the landing zone, one of the principles is to have single control on the management side of it, because all the management policies you can apply from single platform, and all your application workloads which you are creating, whether it's a technology stack specific application workload, whether it's a application type subscription, whether it's a centralized subscription, whatever subscription type and multiple subscription you will have based on the application you onboard, will use a management subscription within landing zone for all controls, right? For all the monitoring parameters. And we try to use native services as far as possible. So like your Azure native monitors in world of AWS, we might land up using AWS CloudWatch. Also from the security log monitoring, we say, let's use Azure Sentinel when we are talking about Azure. But that environment gives me complete control or complete management overview about all the subscription I'm creating for the application workloads. And that's where it's important to have single control management page. The pitfall if for not choosing this is, again, the a little bit of overlapping responsibility. So if you have, let's say, a separate control management defined for SAP environment, and you have a separate control management defined for your systems of engagement application set, right? You're actually having duplication of effort, because there again you're going to do log monitoring, log aggregation, and everything for systems of engagement. You're going to do a similar set of activities, correct? So we can control duplication of effort. We can bring everything into a single control, and you can still use role-based access to provide limited visibility to people, to the IT administrators and to your operations team. But from the aggregation standpoint, you have a single subscription where everything is getting aggregated. So you're not doing duplication of resource, and hence you are also not creating multiple VNet peering from your subscription. You have a single VNet peering happening to a single management control, single management subscription. Correct. So the fourth point, right, is again application-centric service model. So focus more on application-centric subscription creation within your landing zone. We give example, three very prominent example, which is a centralized model, the technology stack-driven model, like AKS is one great example. All the Azure Kubernetes services your developer wants to provision, you create a subscription, which is Azure Kubernetes service subscription, and you can provision all the services, Kubernetes services within that subscription. Your web services, let's say WordPress application, Drupal application, everything can become another layer of your application-centric model and application-centric subscription within your landing zone, and you can start applying all the controls over there. So that's where it's important, and that simplifies your administrative overheads, because you know what controls you need to apply to that, you know what needs to be monitored in that environment. My AKS subscription, I need to monitor it differently, I need to secure it differently than my WordPress subscription, correct? So that's where having application-centric model would greatly help. Last but not least, we touched upon this, but it's important to use as many native services as possible for better integration. So like we give example of Sentinel, right? For log aggregation, and as incident monitoring and event response, we can use Sentinel. And with Sentinel, like all other subscription, what we provision within Azure gets integrated. So that helps me. And obviously, we have visibility to the roadmap. So we know what all Azure native services we can keep provisioning into the environment. And a lot of the, like, for example, now you can provision certain type of landing zone using Bicep directly. Correct? You can provision certain type of landing zone using Terraform directly by using native services. I can use Azure AKS service model to provision complete managed Kubernetes stack onto the Azure. And that becomes part of my one of the consideration into the landing zone, saying what all native services I'm going to utilize. For identity and access management, let's utilize Azure Active Directory, let's utilize the federation services from AD itself. For log management, let's use Azure services. So that's where we are able to reduce again the overhead. We know the communication, VNet peering becomes much more simpler for us when we are utilizing, and even for the firewall, right? If I'm using Azure native firewall, I can define rules just with the help of a tags what I have created while provisioning workloads. And hence, again, during your landing zone creation planning, it becomes important to say, okay, what firewall I'm going to use? I'm going to use Azure native firewall. Wonderful. I'm going to have tags defined when I'm creating subscription, and those tags will be utilized to create the routing, create the traffic filtering. Correct. So it works much simpler. You are able to reduce your operational overhead drastically. You don't need to remember about the IP schema change. You don't need to remember your subnetting and all that. You have created tag. That tag is visible across your tenant, and you are able to utilize tag-based routing. Correct. So that's one example. If you move to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm being a little conscious about the time as well. Yeah, I mean, design areas, correct? Your billing and a directory tenant. We spoke about billing. You can do billing in a multiple manner, and you need to have that planning in place. How you want to do billing? Is it going to be resource group wise? It's going to be business unit wise? It's going to be a region specific billing. So you have you define that, and also when you use when you provision Azure services, right, you have different billing options available, right? You have enterprise subscription, you have reserved instance model, you have spot instance model, you have multiple models available. So when you're creating a landing zone, right, because it's a virtual kind of an environment what you have created, your services are not yet provisioned completely, right? Once you start consuming, and once you start utilizing your different billing model, you are getting charged for that, correct? So at least it does not affect your thought process in creating a landing zone. So when you're creating a landing zone, right, you should know that, okay, what kind of instance I'm going to provision and what kind of billing I'm going to choose for the specific instance. But never restrain your landing zone design based on the billing model, correct? Because billing model is only for the resources getting provisioned inside your subscriptions. The second point is identity and access management. How you going to access your environment, how you going to access your cloud services, what kind of authorization controls you're going to place on the access layer. Now, this can be defined and can be cascaded to different subscriptions within your landing zones and your network topology and connectivity. How are you going to connect to your environment? Now, the implementation strategy or the landing zone strategy for centralized environment versus decentralized environment versus distributed environment may vary a little bit, but your consideration for how you're going to create express route, where you're going to create express route and all needs to be taken into consideration while you are planning your landing zone creation, correct? Also, like how you're going to connect your on-premise environment with Azure tenant. That also needs to be considered well in advance, right? Are you going to use virtual WAN, which is Microsoft managed, when you kind of talk about your network subscription? What kind of VNet peering you want to do when you're creating your traffic route between different subscription models, sorry, different subscription. So those are the things which you will have to consider well in advance when we are talking about network topology and connectivity. Also, from the networking standpoint, we try to move many a thing into VNet peering so that your I mean, there is no charge, there's no charging mechanism, there's no charges right now, rather, let me put it this way. There are no charges right now when you have traffic moving between VNet peers, correct? There's no ingress or egress charge. Also, if you are creating your network topology, you have created your connectivity subscription within your landing zone, and all traffic is coming to your connectivity subscription. And then from that connectivity subscription, if you're kind of panning it out, you just need one express route to the connectivity subscription. From there, you are distributing traffic, correct? So that's one of the consideration. But will it remain same? Answer is no, if you have distributed architecture completely. And hence it's important to, when you're creating your landing zone design, you have to also look at your current distribution of data centers. You have to look at current distribution of your application workloads, how users are accessing them, what kind of network do they use, right? Do they come via public internet? Do they always come via VPN? Do they come only from internal network? All those things also needs to be considered into your environment design area. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, just a quick conceptual architecture. I mean, this is what we spoke about landing zone. And if you look at the landing zone, it has multiple areas. And this is straight from Azure, right? I mean, there are no modifications onto this, but you have the core part of your landing zone at the center, right? Where you have your a platform, where you have your identity, you have management, and your connectivity subscription. Then you have your landing zone related to your application. It could be a corporate application, it could be online application, it could be your SAP application, it could be any other application, correct? And for each of this, there are separate subscription. You got identity subscription, where you have your domain controllers, you have your cost management part of it, you have your Azure monitor deployed within your identity, you have your key vault within your identity subscription. Then you have created your management subscription as a part of your platform. And within that subscription, you have got your log analysis engine, you got your Sentinel on it, you got your charges tracking, you got your, all other queries and alerting and all those mechanisms defined there. And then you have your connectivity subscription, where you are actually, you have your DNS, you have your hub VNet, you have your network connectivity coming in there. And then you have your landing zone, where you have your application specific workloads, right? Your landing zone subscription for SAP, for corp application, for online application, for any of that application. Now, what happens is, and you got DevOps as well for platform automation and for DevOps related workload, where you can have your Git repository, you can have all your scripts in a private repository over there for provisioning workloads, for allocating resources, for deploying certain packages. And those repositories can be utilized every time you create a new subscription, or every time you provision new workload within the landing zone subscriptions, right? Now, what happens is, if you just press one click, Amit, right? I'm just overlapping the same landing zone with AKS services. Now, when you move, or when I want to provision, let's say AKS, what happens is, everything within my core landing zone, right? My platform landing zone remains same. My identity, my connectivity, my management subscription remains same. Only thing what changes is my subscription specifically to the AKS, right? And if you press one more click, if I move this to, let's say, SAP kind of environment, I want to move entire SAP to Azure. What happens? Everything else remains the same. I have created two subscriptions for my SAP A1, A2 cluster, and have moved everything within the application specific subscription, right? So I'm able to utilize same connectivity, I'm able to utilize same identity, I'm able to utilize same management subscription When I'm adding more workloads, only thing which I need to design is this subscription specific to that specific application workload. So every time I want to migrate new application to Azure, I don't need to sit and recreate my connectivity subscription. I don't need to sit and redesign my entire connectivity. So you can look at it more from a well-designed uh, data center, right? If you have a very well-designed data center within your environment, every time you want to provision a new application, only thing you're going to do is not restructure your network. What you will do is open certain firewall ports for that specific application, and you are up and running with that application. That's exactly what we do with well-designed landing zone, where we have connectivity subscription, where all the networking core principles are assigned. Your all policies are well defined, your VNets are well defined, your subnets are defined. And when you create a new application, you just allow traffic, you just do VNet peering, you create new subnets for that application which you have migrated or you have built in your subscription, and allow traffic between them, and rest all remains the same. So that way you are able to reduce your operational overheads significantly. Right, and you're still retaining the same experience what you had in well-defined data center environments. If you go to the next slide, Amit, quickly, and I'll quickly wrap this up and give a pause. Well, there are multiple options, right? You got a very well defined cloud adoption framework now, where with cloud adoption framework, you can actually, with the help of code, you can provision entire landing zone. You can provision enterprise scale landing zone, where you have your platforms, your management, your identity, your network connectivity, all those subscriptions which gets provisioned. Then you have Azure landing zone in a modular manner, where you can use Bicep, which is available on the kit. You can directly provision your landing zone using kit. And when we talk about modular, it's basically taking care of your network connectivity landing zone, your management landing zone, and your identity landing zone. Currently, there's a restriction where you cannot break them further. It provisions all three together. But soon I think we should be able to break them further down. Then you have enterprise scale, small enterprises, landing zone for smaller enterprises, you can do it. You have options where directly, if you go to Terraform, repo from Terraform, you can have fully functional enterprise scale landing zone provision for you. So you can do that. You can create migration specific landing zones, which we spoke about earlier. Application migration, if you want to do, you can migrate them. You can have partner landing zones as well. So on Azure, you have list of partners who can help you create partner specific landing zones also for their specific platform as a service or their specific SaaS what they provide within your Azure tenant subscription. So there are multiple options which are available, but one thing which we need to keep in mind, whether irrespective of the implementation option I want to choose, before you decide to move into Azure landing zone implementation, you need to look at current enterprise of yours into a form like, is it centrally managed enterprise? Is it distributed enterprise, or is it decentralized enterprise, what you have from the management perspective, from the application perspective, and more emphasis on management because that's where you are going to spend most of your time. And once you have done that assessment, based on that, you have to create your landing zone, correct? And when you're creating landing zone, usually I say there are three roles. You have which are important. You have a cloud broker, basically a role who would day zero, who would create a landing zone for you. You got a second role, which is your cloud consumer, which is basically your application team who would provision workloads, their specific workloads into the cloud. Sorry about that. And then you have operations team who will end up managing that entire environment for you. So you'll have these three important roles. So when you're choosing any implementation option, keep these three roles also in mind. And work from that perspective. So who's going to be your cloud broker? Which team would play cloud broker role and will take responsibility of provisioning landing zones for you? Which team will take responsibility of creating your workloads into it? So they are basically cloud consumer. And irrespective of person getting assigned to it, because you are using Azure policies, you're going to use your boundaries within landing zone, you're going to have role-based access. You will have very less chances where mishap can happen, where somebody can go and provision wrong workloads into the Azure or wrong category of VM into the Azure. And then your operations team, who all are going to be part of our operations team. It will be a combination of your traditional operations guy with your DevOps guy, DevSecOps guy, and your SREs who will be part of that operations team to do the platform automation and do the brick-and-mortar monitoring of the environment. But these three roles needs to be kept in mind when you are doing your landing zone implementation, and allocate resources accordingly. When I say resource, it's a human resource who will play that role for you. With that, I'll hand it over to Amit for further section and the wonderful
Thank
case.
you, Jigar. Thank you. Thank you. Now, after understanding and during the readiness phase of a migration journey, the objective is to prepare and understand the roadmap ahead. This phase is accomplished in two major areas: organizational readiness and environmental or technical readiness. Now, depending on the motivations and business outcomes associated with a cloud adoption effort, leaders might be required to establish new org structures or virtual teams to facilitate various functions, such as an organizational alignment or breaking down of silos for better collaboration. During the readiness phase, technical staff are called upon to create a migration landing zone, as Jigar was talking about, that's capable of hosting, operating, and governing workloads that were migrated to the cloud. Developing the necessary skills can be accelerated with all of these following areas. Not all of these skills might be available internally, and therefore choosing the right migration partner is paramount to a successful engagement. Now, let me move on to the next part and talk about one of the use cases that we have recently worked upon, and we have achieved great success in that use case. And I'll also attempt to walk you through a project plan along with the benefits and approach. So one of our customers, which is one of the largest academic healthcare systems, provides patient care for the people of multiple states in the US. It also serves as the training ground for the majority of states' physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals. The customer faced massive challenges with co-located data center where the production workloads were hosted. The customer's web servers would often go through periods of high downtime, resulting from unplanned or unexpected events. The second major concern was an unreliable DNS server, which would redirect unresolvable names to search websites. Their web server was unstable, resulting in an inability to map the path component of a URL. Additionally, they were spending a lot of time and IT bandwidth in maintaining these physical servers and applications. So they wanted us to assess, evaluate, and then recommend the roadmap for movement to Azure to mitigate some or all of these. Parkar team pushed the envelope to adopt Azure's cutting-edge tech stack to build an Azure infrastructure as a service solution to begin with, to suit some of these needs of the customer. We conducted a detailed evaluation which focused on understanding the customer's existing system architecture and deployment setup. This evaluation helped in abstracting the complexity of the underlying architecture and re-engineering the entire piece, which was compatible with the cloud infrastructure. With our detailed workshops conducted with the client, we also identified two pilot workloads that would be ideal candidates for migration to understand, build out some of these scalable components, and to meet some of their migration goals. Finally, it was equally important to create some of these SOPs for cloud operating model and handover to ensure that they have the right skills to maintain this new environment, this new tenant and applications on Azure going forward. Now, let's take a quick look at the high-level project roadmap and implementation plan, if it helps anyone. The whole project was divided into 5 weeks over of 5 phases over a 16-week duration, taking into account that some of the discoveries and deep dives could take a bit of time. During the architecture design phase, we also invited our friends over at Microsoft to go over the high level design and brainstorm over it together with the customer. Creating the landing zone took about 2 to 3 weeks, primarily due to the dependencies upon the customer IT team and policies. But the end result was great, where the workloads could be moved immediately. We did not adopt a typical lift and shift approach for the two pilot workloads, and to ensure that the customer understands the subtleties of migration like this and what are some of the inner details which could also be well documented and gone over. Finally, within a couple of weeks, we held plenty of handholding discussions and workshops with the customer teams, ensuring that they are comfortable with the SOPs and the basics of administering and governing this instance on Azure. Now, Jigar has gone in great detail about the landing zone architecture and the associated design considerations for the same. The final implemented architecture for the customer was a customized version of the reference architecture to account for the networking and security constraints, but it had all of the right principles baked in already. Just a couple of points that are related to the customer's requirements and this particular architecture and use case. The management group hierarchy consisted of creating 3 subscriptions to host central connectivity and one each for the 2 workloads. We recommended placing an Infoblox DNS virtual appliance in the Azure subscription based upon the customer setup to enable name resolution queries to be answered locally within Azure. Azure native backup service was used to back up the virtual machines and store the configuration in recovery services. A dedicated subnet was used for management tools to host all tools and Azure Monitor to collect logs and metrics from various sources. Now, let's look at the final takeaways and learnings from this engagement. Now, with this pilot migration and further migrating a few other workloads, the customer observed more than 40% reduction in operational and infrastructure costs. For one of their new application development initiatives, they again partnered with us to go completely cloud native and saw more than 70% reduction in development time as compared to having gone the traditional route. The end result, this customer is completely convinced of having a cloud strategy and exploring more of what it has to offer. A few learnings, and I cannot emphasize enough about this. We have observed this in multiple engagements about this being maybe a CTO initiative and not enough internal teams brought on board to execute a massive project like this. The first thing we did was talk to the customer and bring many other important stakeholders on the table, such as the operations team, IT, business teams, and others, to talk about the cloud business case and what the future would look like. Everyone or most of them welcomed this, and navigating through was so much easier after this. The Second one is having a proper landing zone design to begin with. Sure, reference architectures are a great starting point, but failing to properly architect and implement the underlying cloud landing zone environments into which workloads are migrated can increase the cost of security and compliance. It is extremely important to choose the right migration partner who has a lot of experience in handling these designs and migrations to the cloud seamlessly. For pilot workloads, starting with lift and shift is probably okay, but a much better use case would be looking at an application which is at a relatively newer technical stack and not much refactoring would be required for cloud migration. Not go the full platform as a service route, but utilizing some of the services and features that the cloud has to offer is always a great idea. Finally, an often ignored area is operating model definition and governance. It is equally important that the IT team understands the new environment and the basic troubleshooting or administration required to maintain this going forward. Managed services contract is wonderful, but having a few champions from the customer team is always a great idea. Now, let's see, looking at doing a quick time check, we have about 4 minutes. So let's do a couple of questions. And then I also wanted to spend a minute on what is the next webinar about. That is going to be part 3 of the series. So let me just quickly cover that, and then we will take a couple of questions from the audience. So the next one is about identifying and planning your pilot and velocity migration. So what are some of the right considerations to identify, to plan it out, and also we will incorporate a demo which will help you get some of the data points in trying to choose the right treatment type. Finally, we will also have another webinar on security and operations readiness. Once you have all of these workloads on the cloud, can you enhance the security? How do you go over some of the governance and the operating model principles? And just ensure that you do have a plan to administer and govern some of this on the cloud. With that, let me take one of the questions. And okay, so one of the very first ones we have is, why do we need to create Azure policies? Uh, Jigar, do you want to cover this?
Sure, Amit. Let me take that. Now, the reason why we need policy is there are two things, right? You got role-based access and you got policies. And I'm assuming question is more specific to why do we create Azure policies? It's to more for governance purpose. You need to create Azure policies. You definitely don't want, I give an example, right? You don't want one of your engineer who has access to Azure to go ahead and spin up NVIDIA GPU based virtual machine for doing a small compute task. Correct. How do you control those kind of mishaps from happening, right? Because they have access to create subscript. I mean, they have access to provision a workload. They can provision Azure services, but you don't want to. You don't want them to go ahead and provision any type of services. So you can control that. Also, you want to control. Let's say I have a team who is developing application which will be accessed by everybody within India geography. Right now, when they are creating this application or when they're provisioning this application in Azure, I don't want them to go ahead and provision virtual machines or provision storage from East Coast in North America. So how do you control these things? For controlling such parameters, you need Azure policies. And it's best used in this manner. Second, I give an example of a tag. You definitely want all the resources getting provisioned to have a specific tag applied to them for better billing purpose, for better routing purpose, for better security compliance purpose. With policy, you can enforce these things. And hence, it's important to leverage Azure policy to its fullest capacity and capability. Hope that answers the question.
Yep. Thank you, Jigar. And we are almost at the end of the webinar. I do see a couple of other questions, but what I'll encourage you to do is either contact